Very excited this morning that our first reading is going to come to us from one of the people that I consider in our congregation to be, I think of as one of our congregational poet laureates. That's not a title that's an official title, but it's what happens in my brain and the way that I think about some of the gifts of a couple people in our community. So this morning, our first reading comes from one of our congregational poet laureates with a recent poem, and she can say anything about the context of this, but I'm really, really grateful this morning to welcome Nyla Francis for our first reading.
This poem. This poem holds no epiphany, is not treatise for making it or harboring hope, instructions for gathering gratitude, cloaked in reverie of a berry harvest, bear tracks along the stream. This poem doesn't claim to be wise, isn't teacher or mulish magic maker writing its way to the light. Though tonight the moon sits high above the fields, and if I look long enough, I can see her slivering into less of who she knows herself to be. Who doesn't want to disappear when the darkness dazzles so deep? Still, she is no oracle, bearer of shine to smooth on your lips, lashes, like lines from a song to dream you home when life becomes unsingable. No, this poem will not save you. Pretend to divine the medicine of the leopard moth caterpillar that curls outside my door. Deliver gifts from heartache, except to say, my heart aches. As it always does when I leave my mom after dinner to drive back to my apartment, and I think of loneliness in a year we've learned to lie to. Love as a distance the imagination crosses. The poet who told the story of visiting his neighborhood bodega, how he wept when he received his change, the cashier's hand cupped over his, which is really what I'm saying. Beneath this ink scrawl, before it runs on, reaches for relief. Oh, the sting of what's become a kindness. These bruises that ripen, return us from unknown, the vanished without touch. I just want to say thank you, Linda, for inviting me to read. And this poem was birthed from many things, listening to a conversation among poets who said sometimes the poem is just a witnessing, not a prescription or anything that, I often turn to poems for wisdom or guidance or some kind of insight. And sometimes it's just a witnessing and a holding. And also, I do every single week. I go and I spend time with my mom and I leave, and I'm always sad thinking of how fleeting time is and all the things we would usually be doing in a year, like so many, instead of just being locked in a room together. And it just makes me sad. Um, so, yeah, there's a lot in there that I was musing on, and I am just grateful for the opportunity to have shared these words with you and hopefully serve as witness to some of the aches that you're carrying too.
Nyla, thank you so much. Thank you so, so much. Our second sacred text comes from the Bible, the book of 1 Corinthians, in the first chapter, verses 18 to 25. It's a confusing text. It sounds like a riddle. It's about the tension between the so-called wisdom or conventional wisdom of the world or the status quo and the wisdom of God. It's about what it says in here is the foolishness of the cross, the foolishness of God's love and vision for justice, the foolishness of the execution of a man whose crime was to call people to love and justice, daring to suggest that the power of God is around and within all of us. From 1 Corinthians. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, God decided, through the foolishness of our proclamation, to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks desire wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block and foolishness, but to those who are the called, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Initially introduced to the United States by well-meaning Shakespeare enthusiasts in Central Park, New York in the late 1800s, the European starling isn't exactly what bird enthusiasts would call a national treasure. Considered an invasive species, it has a bad reputation for dirtying car windshields and eating crops. And yet, the starlings are amazing. They flock together in what is known as a murmuration. These starlings swirl and dance and pulse. They compress and expand, soar and dive. And no one bird is leading because they're all leading. According to scientists, flocks of starlings exhibit a remarkable ability to maintain cohesion as a group in highly uncertain environments. Cohesion as a group in the midst of an uncertain environment? Yes, please. They do this because regardless of the size of the flock, even if the flock is up to 1 million birds, every single starling coordinates its movements with exactly 7 of its neighbors. Anytime one bird shifts direction or changes speed, all of the other birds respond nearly simultaneously, regardless of the size of the flock. Each bird is tuned in to 7 birds around it, and those birds are tuned into 7 birds around them, times 1,000,000. Apparently, 7 is the perfect number, according to scientists, to optimize the balance between individual effort and group cohesion. The scientist Granger Hunt explains that these aerial spectacles are caused by a falcon that's near the edge of the flock. It turns out that the beauty of a murmuration's movements often purely arises out of defense, as the starlings strive to put distance between themselves and the predator. Scientists have been able to explain what starlings do, but they haven't been able to explain how they could consistently demonstrate such a collective response. People of faith who know that we're not alone, but are held together by some larger love, some deeper spirit, might not be particularly surprised at this phenomenon. which doesn't make it easy to do. And all of it requires deep trust. I see these starlings and my heart soars and it also sinks. I feel this incredible longing. Doesn't this describe what a church could be? So powerful, so fluid, knowing that each one participates, but no one has to carry it all. A group of us who the world might deem invasive, messy, annoying, soaring and moving together, protecting one another from predators, balancing individual effort and group cohesion. Imagine thinking about those birds. Imagine looking at the 7 birds around you. And imagine that one is a child, one an elder, one is trans, one is straight, one is black, one is white, one is living with chronic illness or pain. And imagine that the 7 of them and you are moving together, listening, noticing, learning from each other, feeling out a pace that works, figuring out what direction to take, figuring out how to keep each other safe and how each of you can be all you were called to be, soaring and pulsing and changing shape like those incredible starlings in flight. Nyla spoke of heartache. My heart aches when I dream of or imagine a murmurating church. Because most days, like a gravity-bound turkey, I can see that I have wings, I'm watching others fly, and I can't seem to get myself off the ground. I feel like Rocky, not the Rocky who runs up the art museum steps, but Rocky, the rooster in the movie Chicken Run, which I highly recommend, who gets shot out of a cannon in a traveling circus, crash lands onto a farm, and keeps trying to figure out how to fly. I've made a lot of mistakes lately and been so unmurmurating. I haven't communicated when I needed to communicate. I haven't supported our finest leaders in the ways that they deserved and needed to be supported. When I'm under stress, I don't know about you, but when I'm under stress, I overcompensate and I overfunction. And sometimes instead of supporting and developing others, I've sometimes tried to take care of people by lightening their loads. Hey, it's a pandemic and we're all struggling. I can help you with that. Not because I want to control things, but because it's the way I have learned to try to help. But I'm also learning that the impulse to help by taking things off other people's plates deprives all of us of the gifts that they have to offer and deprives them of the opportunity to lead us. I take on too much and I don't always follow through. There's so much potential, even in this hard moment, so many things that I'm so excited about that I try and want to do too much. And when I'm either excited or under duress, I go into overdrive. I go fast. And that often means I go alone instead of going slow and going together. And going fast is ableist. Ableism is the belief and the practice that people without disabilities are superior, but more importantly, that those of us without disabilities are the normal ones. The world is built for bodies like mine, in the same way that it's built for skin like mine. And there's an assumption buried deep within all of the structures and every aspects of our society that whiteness and able-bodiedness are the norms. My own ableism has meant that I don't realize that I sometimes expect others to keep up with me instead of letting them set the pace and learning to follow. Now, some of this is just me and my personality, my quirks, my conditioned tendencies under stress, my own blind spots. Some of it's just me and a pandemic. I'm guessing I'm not the only one who's not exactly at the top of their game. And a good bit of it is probably also my whiteness. I'm not telling you these things because I want you to defend me or feel sorry for me. I've been here for 20 years. That's a good time to work on a new set of commitments that make sense for this community and this time that we're in. And I'm hoping that we can do some of that together. Elections may be over, but we're still in the middle of a hard and important moment as a nation of reckoning, revising, reflecting, and thinking about who we will be as a country. More people than ever have come to notice and realize that our social structures and institutions have always been built to serve some of us at the expense of others of us. In a time of uprising and national reckoning, our church did a pretty incredible job of taking the prophetic message that Black Lives Matter out into the world and finding ways to support those within our church who were in the streets and amplifying those messages wherever we were. So many of us showed up in a moment when it mattered that people of faith were showing up for Black lives and trans lives, protesting, studying, learning, committing, risking, calling out police violence, supporting one another, taking a new and critical look at the world outside with a racial justice lens. What if we turned that same zeal and passion and dared to take what we've learned about the way whiteness works outside and also look inside? How gutsy and scary would that be? What if we knew that we were actually murmurating together, or could, noticing, listening, paying attention to one another and being paid attention to ourselves, knowing that we were holding and being held by each other and by God? What if white supremacy were the falcon? There are many, and sticking together we could protect each other and all heal and thrive. I don't know about you, and we all come from different places, but I know that I am a product of white dominant culture. And that term means that the main values and assumptions and needs that have shaped almost every aspect of our lives and the history of this country have been organized around experience of people who are white and middle class and historically male. As a kid, one of the main games that we played, and maybe you did too, was follow the leader. I grew up being taught by the white middle class world around me that there were leaders and there were followers. I, for some reason, was groomed to be a leader, and I suspect that many of you were too. I was taught, and maybe you were too, that we either lead or we follow. And I don't mean that I was taught this by my parents, who are actually in church here today and did a great job. I was taught this by the world that I grew up in. We either lead or we follow. This is a church full of leaders. And leading in and itself is not bad. It's necessary and can be a great gift. But I know that I, at least, was not taught how to be part of a murmuration. I was not taught about collective salvation or liberation or collective thriving. I wasn't taught about community survival, because the assumption was that people like me, white and middle class and educated and Christian, would always survive. White dominant culture values a lot of things. Individuality over community, competition over collaboration, conflict avoidance over growth and learning. We're a predominantly white church. Not, thanks be to God, an all-white church like so many churches in this country. So many of us are here in this church because we want to be in a place with people who live and love and experience the world in ways that are different from our own. And we are growing in so many ways. It's also true that all the senior level pastors in the 175-year history of this church have all been white, and all but one in 175 years have been men. The vast majority of our church leaders over those years have been white, not all, and most of our members have been white over all those years. That's not anything we need to or should feel bad about. It's been changing, but being aware of it might help make it easier to notice patterns, things that have worked well, and things that we want to build on, and things that we want to change that will help us all to grow and heal. It's what we started doing in our strategic planning process a while back, and what we'll find a way to continue doing moving forward, somehow together, finding our North Star and setting our priorities and drawing a map. This morning's text from 1 Corinthians talks about how God's vision of love, of kingdom, of a new economy and new order crashes up against the so-called wisdom of the world, the status quo. Part of the call to be church is to challenge, resist, and break up with those orders that aren't rooted in love. This church is amazing. It's taken risks on love before that have had weighty consequences. Some of you that are here this morning took a dying church 30 years ago and you dared to try a radically new thing, risking it all. We are all here now because of you and those that took that chance with you. Some of you here this morning have stood firmly against the homophobia of the United Methodist Church and defied the rules, knowing that you actually could lose the church, and you supported a pastor who was willing to risk his whole career to marry people that loved one another regardless of their gender. 10 years ago, this church took a risk to throw in with the United Church of Christ when the Methodists put an extraordinarily gifted minister who happened to be a lesbian on trial. 10 years ago, this church voted to be an anti-racist church and committed to doing that work. And we're still trying to figure out what that looks like. We're also still waiting to hear whether the United Methodist Church will finally decide to affirm the full humanity of all God's people, or whether we'll need to break up and bear the costs. What bold faith does this moment call us to? And what does it look like to you? What does it look like to the 7 around you and to the 7 around them? Murmurating church. It's what Dr. King called beloved community in the truest, deepest, and highest sense. To be honest, it terrifies me, which is one of the ways the prophets in the Hebrew scriptures knew that God was at work, because they were usually terrified at the message. The author, doula, women's rights activist, and Black feminist Adrienne Marie Brown talks about the power of learning together in public, which, it seems to me, is also what church is about. Writing about what I would call the parable of the starlings, she says, "My dream is a movement with such deep trust that we move as a murmuration. The way the group of starlings billow, dive, spin, and dance collectively through the air to avoid predators, and it also seems to pass time in the most beautiful way possible. There is a right relationship, a right distance between them. Too close and they crash, too far away and they can't feel the micro adaptations of other bodies. Each creature is shifting direction, speed, and proximity based on the information of the other creature's bodies. There's deep trust in this," she writes, "to lift because all the birds around you are lifting, to live based on your collective real-time adaptations. In this way, thousands of birds or fish or bees can move together, each empowered with basic rules and a vision to live. Imagine our movements cultivating this type of trust and depth with each other." Imagine indeed. This is God's good news. Amen.